Hey guys, Stone Cold Export here. After the review was done, I discovered an issue with the Strix model that we have for testing today. So the screws that is supposed to hold the heatsink to the VRM are too long, so they are essentially non-functioning. As you can see in the clip here, by touching the back of the heatsink, the entire thing moves. On my girlfriend's 1070 Strix model, the same screws hold the heatsink tightly against the VRM, or the thermal pads at least. Now this could explain the somewhat high VRM temperatures that you will see in a bit. At first I thought they were just not tightened down properly, so I attempted to tighten them down with the screwdriver, but they are in fact tight, they're just too long, so they don't do anything. I don't know if other Strix models are affected. If you have one, please let me know in the comments below. I have contacted Asus, but have yet to receive a meaningful response, but this will be reflected in the build quality grade. So this model has an MSRP of $460, which is very close to, for instance, the Zotac 2070 Super Twin Fan model. So Asus certainly hasn't taken any chances when it comes to design, and if you had a Strix model before, this should be very familiar. It is almost identical to previous models, such as the GTX 1070 Strix. The fan shroud itself is pretty much identical and made of plastic. The backplate is almost identical as well, apart from the cutouts, and it is made of metal. The fans are probably the largest change, along with the massive heatsink and the heat spreader. My biggest gripe with the design is those horrible rainbow colored wires at the end of the card. I kinda wish those were black or covered up. The card is outfitted with two 4-pin fan headers and an RGB header at the end of the card, and the card itself also features plenty of RGB. On the backplate there is a large RGB lit ROG logo. On top of the card there is a smaller ROG logo, and you'll also find RGB lights around the fans. So you'll have plenty of RGB with the card vertically or horizontally mounted. A nice detail is the black PCI bracket, where you will find one HDMI port and 3 display ports. On the back of the card there is a BIOS switch, where you can choose between a performance BIOS or a quiet BIOS, and you'll also find a button to turn off the RGB lighting. This card will occupy 2.7 or 3 PCI slots, and it weighs in at 1425 grams. It is 30.5 centimeters long, 13 centimeters tall, and 5.4 centimeters thick. And Asus has fitted two 8-pin power connectors, which should supply plenty of power. The massive heatsink features 6 nickel-plated 6mm heat pipes, and it cools the GPU and the VRM. The black heat spreader is in charge of cooling the memory chips and the memory VRM. This card also has the so lovely 0dB mode, or fan stop feature, which switches off the fans when under a certain temperature. Not only does this mean that the card is completely silent when idle or under light loads, but it also minimizes dust buildup, which means you can spend more time gaming and less time cleaning out the GPU heatsink. Asus lists game clock speeds as up to 1965 MHz for OC mode and 1905 for gaming mode. Both of these numbers are with the performance BIOS, and the modes are chosen by using Asus GPU Tweak 2. I tried the utility but did not find it particularly useful. For instance, when you choose one of the modes, you lose 0dB mode for whatever reason, which causes the fan to spin at 950 RPM when idle, and the 0dB mode switch in the software seemingly does nothing. Actually, you lose 0dB mode whenever you make a change in Wattman as well, even if it's just changing the memory clock. Only way I found to get it back was to reset the machine. This problem was not present on the Power Color Red Dragon. Let's move on to the tests. So we start off by testing the average clock speed when benchmarking Gears of War 5 at 1440p, and we are comparing it with the much cheaper and lighter Power Color Red Dragon. So with the performance BIOS, the average core clock was 1954 MHz when running the Gears of War 5 benchmark, 134 MHz faster than the OC BIOS on the Red Dragon, and over 200 MHz higher than the silent BIOS on the Red Dragon. The quiet BIOS didn't really do much with the clock speed, and it only dropped by 4 MHz, and the difference would be larger if we had a longer benchmarking run, which would allow the card to heat up more, and the clock would drop more as a result. When everything in Wattman is turned to 11 with 50% power limit and maxed out core clock and memory frequency, The average core clock increased by a mere 110 MHz. This is well short of the 2150 MHz target in Wattman. Now let's take a look at how this cooler performs in an open-air test bench. The performance BIOS resulted in a fan speed of 1806 RPM, around 100 RPM slower than the dual-fan Red Dragon. The silent BIOS had a much lower fan speed of 1350 RPM, which was 50 RPM slower than the silent BIOS on the Red Dragon card. Overclocking causes the fan speed to increase to 2180 RPM, and as a result noise also increases, as we will look at next. So here we have noise in dBA measured 30 cm away from the GPU in an open-air test bench. The performance BIOS resulted in 43 dBA, which is a good result. The quiet BIOS though did extremely well at under 38.5 dBA, which is the lowest noise level I have measured so far. Even lower than the excellent MSI GTX 1070 Gaming X, which is not present in this chart, but did 39.5 dBA. The low noise level does come at the cost though, which we will see in the next chart. Here we have temperatures in Celsius over ambient in the open-air test bench when running the Firestrike Ultra Stress Test 3 consecutive times. The Asus Strix had the lowest GPU temp at 46.5 degrees over ambient, which in a 22 degree room would result in a GPU temp of 68.5 degrees Celsius. Switching to the silent BIOS caused the temperature to increase by 7 degrees Celsius at 53.5 degrees over ambient, which in a 22 degree room would result in 25.5 degrees Celsius. Perhaps more alarming is that the memory temps is now at 69.5 Celsius over ambient, which results in a temperature of 91.5 C in a 22 degree room, which is it's within the safe limits, but it's getting up there. Now the VRM temps is 51.5 degrees Celsius over ambient with the performance BIOS, which would be 73.5 degrees Celsius in a 22 degree room. What is most striking here is how much better the VRM and memory temperatures are on the Red Dragon card. Now the memory temperature is 10 degrees Celsius lower on the Red Dragon with the OC BIOS, and the VRM temperature is 12 degrees lower. The Red Dragon uses the same heatsink for the GPU, memory and VRM, which might explain the lower temperatures, along with the fact that the fan themselves are much closer to the components due to the dual slot design of that card. Now let's move on to power consumption when running Firestrike. Here we have the power draw from the 12 volt rail of a Corsair RM1000i power supply when running Firestrike Extreme. The performance BIOS on the Strix model consumes 333 watts, slightly more than the 2070 Super and 15 watts more than the Red Dragon with the OC BIOS. The quiet BIOS on the Strix model pulls only slightly less power at 324 watts, which explains why it runs so much warmer. A 2.7% decrease in power consumption, but a 25% decrease in fan speed. Now the quiet BIOS on the Strix pulls 37 watts more than the silent BIOS on the Red Dragon, and when overclocked, the Strix is pulling 391 watts from the 12 volt rail. And that's over 100 watts more than the silent BIOS on the Red Dragon and 58 watts more than the performance BIOS on this Strix model. Before we move on to performance in Firestrike, I need to point out a slight issue I had with this card. When using the quiet BIOS, the card would sometimes, for no apparent reason, drop the fan speed down to 1100 RPM, causing the temperatures to increase. To show you this, I started up superposition and let it run for 20 minutes while logging temperatures and fan speed with the hardware info. And this is the result. These numbers are inside a Fractal defined R6 case, and the light blue line is fan speed and corresponds to the left axis. Shortly after halfway, you can see the fan speed suddenly drop to about 1000 RPM before it starts rising again. Up until this point, the fan speed is pretty stable at around 1400 RPM, and the GPU temp reached 83C while the GPU junction temp maxed out at 100 degrees Celsius after the drop in fan speed. And the memory temperature maxed out at 96 degrees Celsius, these are not acceptable temperatures for a high-end model, in my opinion. I ran the performance BIOS through the same test, and here is the result. As you can see, I did not have the fan speed issue with the performance BIOS, and here you can see that the fans are spinning up to 1800 RPM, and they are staying there for the duration of the test. This time the GPU maxed out at 73C with a junction temperature of 90 degrees and a memory temperature of 84 degrees Celsius. Now let's move on to performance in Firestrike. The test system is the Ryzen R5 3600 with 38 C18 memory, overclocked to 3733 MHz at CL15 on an ASRock X470 Taichi motherboard. In Firestark, the Strix 5700 XT scored 27,806 points. In the performance BIOS, which is 5% ahead of the Red Dragon, 18% ahead of the 2060 Super, and 1% ahead of the 2070 Super. Overclocking increases performance by 5%, and we're now at 29,212 points. Moving on to Time Spy, the Asus Strix 5700 XT scored 9,199 points, still 5% ahead of the Red Dragon, but this time it is 2% behind the 2060 Super and 10% behind the 2070 Super. Now let's move on to gaming benchmarks. We start off with Battlefield 5. At 1080p, the Asus Strix did 145.8 frames per second on average, edging out the Red Dragon and the reference model by 3% and having a healthy lead over both the 2070 Super and the 2060 Super. At 1440p, the Strix is 5% ahead of the Red Dragon and the reference model, while being 16% ahead of the 2070 Super and 29% faster than the 2060 Super. At 4K, the Strix is now 5% ahead of the Red Dragon, 9% ahead of the 2070 Super, and 21% ahead of the 2060 Super. Due to the map change in Fortnite, I have swapped that out with Control. So in Control at 1080p, the Strix 5700 XT did 96.7 frames per second on average, being 2% ahead of the 2060 Super, but 10% behind the 2070 Super. Moving to 1440p, and the Strix 5700 XT is now down to 61.4 frames per second on average, behind the 2060 Super by a single percent, but the 2070 Super has a 13% lead at 1440p. In 4K, the 5700 XT did 29.8 frames per second on average, about the same as the 2060 Super, and the 2070 Super was 14% ahead. Next game is The Division 2. At 1080p, the Strix 5700 XT did 101.3 frames per second on average, about the same as the Red Dragon and 3% ahead of the reference 5700 XT and the 2060 Super. The 2070 Super, on the other hand, is nearly 14% ahead. On to 1440p, and here the Strix did 70.3 frames per second on average, being 2% faster than the quiet mode on the card, and 7% ahead of the 2060 Super. The 2070 Super though still has an 8% lead. At 4K, the Strix did 36.6 frames per second on average, being 5% ahead of the 2060 Super and 10% behind the 2070 Super. Now, on to Devil May Cry 5. Here at 1080p, the Strix 5700 XT did 173 frames per second on average, being 6% ahead of the 2060 Super and 3% ahead of the reference 5700 XT. It still can't quite catch up to the 2070 Super, which enjoys a 4% lead. At 1440p, the Strix is on par with the 2070 Super at 116.2 frames per second on average, 9% ahead of the 2060 Super and 2% ahead of the reference 5700 XT. On to 4K, and here the Strix model did 61 frames per second on average, 8% ahead of the 2060 Super and the Red Dragon, but it's now again 6% behind the 2070 Super. Forza Horizon 4 is up next, and at 1080p, the Strix did 156.2 frames per second on average, on par with the 2070 Super, 2% ahead of the Red Dragon 5700 XT and 14% ahead of the 2060 Super. At 1440p, the Strix model did 125.3 frames per second on average, and it is here within margin of error of both the Red Dragon and the 2070 Super. The lead over the 2060 Super is slightly larger though at 15%. In 4K, the Strix did 81.6 frames per second on average, 3% behind the 2070 Super, but 3% ahead of the Red Dragon, and a larger 13% ahead of the 2060 Super. Next title is Gears of War 5. At 1080p here, the Strix did about the same as the Red Dragon at 110.9 frames per second on average, a 4% lead over the 2070 Super and 14% ahead of the 2060 Super. In 1440p, the Strix now did 77.6 frames per second on average, 3% ahead of the Red Dragon and the 2070 Super, and a whopping 21% ahead of the 2060 Super. At 4K, we're now down to 40.9 frames per second on average, and the Strix is now on par with the 2070 Super, but 7% ahead of the 2060 Super. And I have migrated from Ghost Recon Wildlands to Breakpoint for this review. I'm using the Ultimate preset to put as much load on the GPU as possible. Unfortunately, this AMD sponsored title did not run well with the AMD GPU, at least not with the Ultimate preset. Either way, at 1080p, the 5700 XT did 69.9 frames per second on average, about the same as the 2070 Super, but 15% ahead of the 2060 Super. Let's see what happens when we turn up the resolution to 1440p. So here the 5700 XT Strix did 49 frames per second on average, being 5% behind the 2070 Super, but still 12% ahead of the 2060 Super. A rather hollow victory when we turn our attention to the frame times. The 2060 Super has a better 0.1% low than the 5700 XT's 1% low figure. The result is that the Nvidia cards, even the 1070, feel a lot smoother. So at last 4K, it all falls apart for the 5700 XT here. On average, the 5700 XT did 22.1 frames per second, but look at those frame times. And again, this is a 3-run average figure, so every time there is a massive stuttering at 4K. Of course, you probably don't play at the Ultimate preset, but that is no excuse for these numbers, especially when the Nvidia cards have decent frame times. And I assume this is down to drivers, despite the fact that the AMD drivers claim support for the game. Let's move on from this disappointing result and look at Rainbow Six Siege. At 1080p, the 5700 XT Strix did 195.7 frames per second on average, 4% ahead of the reference model and 5% ahead of the 2060 Super. The 2070 Super though is a mere percent ahead. In 1440p, the Strix did 124.9 frames per second on average in the performance BIOS, 4% ahead of the quiet BIOS. It is now 7% ahead of the reference model and 12% ahead of the 2060 Super, but it is 2% behind the 2070 Super. In 4K, we're now down to 58 frames per second on average, and the 2060 Super has now overtaken the 5700 XT and is 4% ahead. The 2070 Super is 16% ahead, but the Strix model is still 7% faster than the reference model. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next, and at 1080p, the 5700 XT Strix did 106.3 frames per second on average, tying the 2070 Super, and it is 10% faster than the 2060 Super. At 1440p, the Strix did 70.6 frames per second on average, while the 2070 Super is now 3% ahead, but the Strix model is 9% ahead of the 2060 Super. Moving to 4K, and we're now down to 36 frames per second on average, 4% ahead of the 2060 Super, but 6% behind the 2070 Super. The last game we're looking at is The Witcher 3. So in The Witcher 3 at 1080p, the Strix 5700 XT did 118.1 frames per second on average, 2% ahead of the reference model, but the Nvidia cards are clearly faster here. So the 2060 Super is 7% ahead and the 2070 Super enjoys a 16% lead. 1440p does level things out, and the Strix is here 2% ahead of the 2060 Super and the reference 5700 XT at 85.8 frames per second on average, but the 2070 Super is still 4% in the lead. At 4K, the Strix is on par with the 2060 Super, but the 2070 Super is 12% ahead. Now let's see how things change if we overclock the 5700 XT Strix model. We're starting off with The Witcher 3 at 1440p. The overclock now has the Strix at 91 frames per second on average, a 7% increase. It is now faster than even the overclock 2060 Super. The overclock 2070 Super though still has a 12% lead. In Gears of War 5, the overclocked Strix model did 82.8 frames per second on average, a 7% increase in performance, and it is now 4% ahead of the overclocked 2070 Super and 20% ahead of the overclocked 2060 Super. Last game for the overclocking numbers is Rainbow Six Siege. In Siege, the overclocked improved performance by 6%, and the Strix now did 132.9 frames per second on average. The overclocked 2070 Super is still 4% ahead, but the Strix is 7% faster than the overclocked 2060 Super. Now let's look at power consumption in The Witcher 3 at 1440p. This is total system power draw from the PSU. At stock, the Strix pulled 365 watts, slightly more than the 2070 Super, and a good 40 watts more than the Red Dragon and the reference model. Switching to the quiet BIOS decreases power consumption by 20 watts, bringing it closer to the 2060 Super, and when overclocked, the power consumption is about the same as the overclocked reference model at 405 watts. Next up is watt per FPS in Witcher 3. So with the performance mode, the Strix needed 4.4 watts per FPS delivered in Witcher 3, quite a bit more than the reference model and the Red Dragon, which both needed less than 4 watts. Overclocking means a slightly higher figure at 4.45 watts per FPS. The quiet BIOS though did 4.3 watts per FPS. Now let's look at the relative performance in 1440p. First off, we start comparing performance in 7 of the games tested to compare with the reference model and the Red Dragon. And here the Strix is 4% faster than the reference model and the Red Dragon. Now let's see results with the 10 games tested in this review. So in the 10 games tested, the 5700 XT is still 10% ahead of the 2060 Super, but it is 1% behind the 2070 Super at 1440p. When it comes to price to performance, we are dividing price per averaged FPS at 1440p. We're only using 9 games here as Fortnite is excluded due to it not being tested on the Strix. So the Asus Strix RX 5700 XT comes in at $4.94 per average FPS in 1440p. You still get more performance per dollar with this than the super cards, but you do not get the dedicated hardware for ray tracing that the Nvidia cards are offering, and frankly your money will probably be better spent on one of the cheaper high-end models such as the PowerColor Red Devil, the MSI Gaming X or the Sapphire Nitro Plus. But now it is time to grade the card in noise, temperature and build quality. Due to the dual BIOS nature of the card, each BIOS will receive a grade in noise and temperature. Starting with the performance BIOS, in temperature this card gets an A. In the OpenAir test bench, the temperature was below 7 degrees Celsius if we use an ambient temperature of 22 degrees. The ambient when tested was 22.5 degrees Celsius and the absolute temperature was 69 C. Bear in mind that as long as the memory and VRM temperatures are within safe limits, they do not impact this grade. This is due to the fact that not all cards report these temperatures. In noise, the performance BIOS did 43 dBA when measured 30 cm away from the fans, and this results in a B in noise. Now let's grade the quiet BIOS. In temperature, the quiet BIOS receives a C, barely. When it comes to noise, it should come as no surprise that the quiet BIOS receives an A, with the lowest recorded noise level yet. When it comes to build quality, the grade is F. A $460 card should not have the issues explained in the start of the video. If it weren't for those screws, it would have gotten a C. Even if it doesn't affect performance, these kind of issues should not be present on a high-end model, or any model for that matter. So to the conclusion then, do I recommend the Asus ROG Strix RX 5700 XT? At MSRP, no I don't, and given the build quality issues, I don't feel I would recommend it even at the same price as the other high-end models. There are competing models at lower price point that I would rather get, and there's a very small gap to the MSRP model of the 2070 Super, which are decent cards. And that's all I had for you for now. Thank you so much for watching, and farewell.